Finally. That was the single sharp word that slipped from my daughter's lips when I looked her in the eyes and told her that my life savings, my business, and my financial security had completely collapsed. She didn't reach across the table to take my hand. She didn't ask if I had enough money to buy groceries for the coming week, or where I was going to sleep when the winter frost settled over the New England coast. She didn't even look at me with a passing flicker of concern. Instead, her cold, calculating eyes slowly scanned the high exposed beam ceilings of my living room, landing on the handcrafted mantelpiece, before she asked a single devastating question. So does this mean the Cape Cod house is gone too? In that frozen, agonizing second, the last remaining illusion of my fatherhood was violently stripped away. I looked at Sienna, my only child, and I understood with absolute, bone-chilling clarity that she wasn't terrified of losing her 68-year-old father to the cold grip of poverty. She was only terrified that her massive anticipated inheritance was slipping through her fingers. What she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly have guessed, was that exactly 3 days before that conversation, I had sat in a quiet, wood-paneled law office in Boston and completely rewritten my last will and testament. And as I sat there in the quiet of my home, listening to her dismissive tone, I didn't regret my decision for a single solitary second. Welcome back to Dad's real-life revenge. Grab yourself a warm cup of coffee, a few snacks, get comfortable, and remember, the people in these stories had every opportunity to do the right thing. They simply chose the path of vanity and greed. Leave a comment with the number 1 in the section below so we can keep our family of listeners growing. And make sure to hit that subscribe button. You are going to absolutely enjoy the sheer clinical precision of this one. It was a bleak, rain-slicked Sunday in early November when the stage was set for our final reckoning. Outside the towering arched windows of my Cape Cod estate, the Atlantic Ocean was a violent, churning expanse of slate gray, and a heavy, bone-chilling coastal nor'easter was beginning to batter the coastline. The wind howled through the ancient pitch pines, throwing sheets of freezing rain against the double-paned glass. For this lunch, I had made a deliberate, calculated choice in my appearance. I had bypassed my custom-tailored wool sweaters and my polished Italian leather boots. Instead, I pulled on an old, faded flannel work shirt with a frayed collar, a pair of plain, heavy canvas trousers that I typically wore while working in my woodshop, and a pair of salt-stained, scuffed dock shoes. I wore no gold watch, no platinum rings, and no expensive accessories. I wanted to look exactly like a man who had spent the last 3 weeks staring at a blank wall, worn down by the exhausting, suffocating weight of an impending financial ruin. At the other end of the dining table, my daughter Sienna and her husband Tristan were completely oblivious to my quiet internal storm. They were deeply immersed in their own luxurious world, their heads huddled close over Sienna's glowing smartphone screen, as they eagerly planned a lavish winter getaway to St. Moritz. "Look at this chalet, Tristan!" Sienna cooed, her manicured finger tapping the screen. The diamond bracelet I had bought her for her birthday sparkled under the light. The master suite has a panoramic view of the Swiss Alps, and it comes with a private ski-in, ski-out deck. We absolutely have to book it for at least 2 weeks. Tristan, dressed in an immaculate, cream-colored cashmere sweater that had been quietly funded by my quarterly corporate distributions, took a slow, appreciative sip of his expensive vintage wine. "It's perfect, sweetheart," he murmured, adjusting his designer glasses. "We deserve a proper escape after the stress of the autumn season. Your father's maritime design firm has had an incredibly profitable run, so we don't need to worry about the budget." I sat in silence, watching the two of them. It was a scene I had witnessed 100 times before. For years their high-end travel, their designer wardrobes, and their luxurious social calendar had been quietly, systematically bankrolled by my blood, sweat, and tears. I had spent 45 years building Montgomery custom yachts, transforming a small boat repair yard into a prestigious marine engineering firm. I had spent my youth working 14-hour days on freezing windswept dry docks, inhaling fiberglass dust and welding fumes, all so that my family would never know the terrifying, suffocating anxiety of financial insecurity. My beloved wife, Evelyn, had been my partner in every sense of the word. She had managed our modest budget in the early years, packing my lunches in metal tins and patching my work jeans. When Sienna was born, we swore we would give her a life that was second to none. But Evelyn, with her deep, intuitive wisdom, had seen the dangerous trajectory we were on long before I did. 4 years before she lost her courageous battle with pancreatic cancer, Evelyn had sat with me on the porch, watching a teenage Sienna storm into the house because I had bought her a high-end luxury sedan instead of the sports car she wanted. "Caleb," Evelyn had whispered, her gentle hand resting heavily on my calloused knuckles. You have to let her fall on her own. You can't keep building a soft velvet runway for her to land on for the rest of her life. I had brushed her concerns aside with a warm, dismissive smile. She's our only child, Evelyn, I had replied. I want her to have everything we never had. What's the point of all this wealth if I can't use it to make her life beautiful and effortless? Evelyn had looked at me with a profound, lingering sadness in her ocean blue eyes. Yes, she is our daughter, Caleb. But she is not a client. You cannot keep providing premium services to her in exchange for her affection. Her words had echoed in my mind for years, a silent warning bell that I desperately tried to ignore. After Evelyn passed away, the crushing, suffocating loneliness of my empty house made me even more vulnerable. In my desperate, aching desire to maintain a connection with my only remaining family, I spoiled Sienna even more. But as I sat at the dining table on that rain-swept Sunday, looking at the two predatory strangers who shared my bloodline, I knew that the contract was about to be cancelled. I gently set my coffee cup down onto its porcelain saucer. The tiny metallic clink of the ceramic against the wood cut sharply through their cheerful chatter, causing the spacious kitchen to fall into a sudden, expectant silence. I had a very long, difficult meeting with my chief financial officer and my accountant last night, I said, keeping my voice low, letting it tremble with a carefully calculated touch of exhaustion. Sienna didn't even look up from her phone. Oh, really? Is there some boring supply chain delay with the new carbon fiber hulls again, Dad? You really need to hire someone else to handle those administrative headaches. No, Sienna, I replied, taking a deep, ragged breath and looking her straight in her cold, green eyes. It's much worse than that. The firm suffered a massive, catastrophic structural failure. Our European investments collapsed, and the banks have called in our primary credit lines. I think I've lost almost everything. The silence that followed stretched over the dining room like a thick, suffocating fog, broken only by the rhythmic, heavy pounding of the cold rain against the window pane. I waited in those agonizing seconds, holding my breath, desperately praying for a single natural word of concern. I wanted her to ask, "Dad, are you okay? Or what can we do to help?" I would have given anything to see a flicker of genuine, heartfelt worry in her eyes. But Sienna's finger simply stopped scrolling across her screen. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then, a short, sharp, and incredibly cruel laugh burst from her throat. It was a sound carrying a chilling sense of relief, a noise that felt like a cold blade sliding between my ribs. Finally, she blurted out. I stared at her, my heart tightening inside my chest until I could barely breathe. "What did you just say, Sienna?" Tristan's face shifted from relaxed comfort to an awkward, weary tension. He reached under the table, lightly kicking his wife's foot to signal her to stay silent, but Sienna was entirely past the point of restraint. "You heard me, Dad," Sienna shrugged, leaning back in her upholstered chair and crossing her arms over her chest with an air of cold, haughty indifference. "All my life, you've acted like you were some kind of invincible, flawless superhero. You controlled everyone's destiny with your checkbook, always lecturing us about work ethic, discipline, and the value of a dollar. You acted like you were completely untouchable." I looked deeply into her eyes, desperately searching for any trace of the sweet, bright-eyed little girl who used to hold my hand as we walked along the sandy beaches of Cape Cod, pointing at the seagulls and laughing. But that little girl was completely gone, replaced by a cold, entitled stranger who saw my financial ruin as a personal victory. Are you at all worried about how I'm going to survive in these days ahead, Sienna?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, thick with a very real, aching sorrow. "I am nearly 70 years old. My health is declining, and I have no other source of income." Sienna sighed, rolling her eyes with an air of intense irritation. "Oh, please, Dad, you're an adult. You've been managing major corporate budgets for 40 years. I'm sure you'll figure out how to downsize and get by on Social Security like everyone else. Tristan and I have our own family, our own mortgage, and our own financial goals to worry about." The room fell into an absolute, freezing stillness. Tristan looked down at his porcelain plate, suddenly finding the pattern of his silver fork incredibly fascinating, while Sienna stared at me with an unyielding, defensive glare. "What about this house?" I asked quietly, looking around the beautifully restored living room, with its hand-carved mahogany panels and historic nautical paintings. "This is the house where your mother took her last breath, Sienna. It has been in our family for over 30 years. Sienna's eyes instantly flashed with a sharp, predatory gleam. The casual indifference on her face vanished, replaced by a sudden, intense tension that hardened her features. "The house is gone too?" she demanded, her voice rising an octave, thick with a sudden, panicked anger. "Why on earth would you let this estate be lost to the banks, Caleb? How could you be so incredibly reckless? This property is worth millions. It was a bitter, devastating confirmation. Sienna wasn't upset that her father was facing a terrifying, destitute old age. She was only furious because the prime real estate she had secretly considered, her own future property, was disappearing before she could get her hands on it. But if her reaction to the house had been the worst thing that happened that Sunday afternoon, I might have found some way to rationalize her cruelty. I might have convinced myself that she was simply in shock, or that her words were driven by a sudden, overwhelming panic. She stood up from the table, pacing across the polished hardwood floor of the kitchen, her heels clicking sharply like a metronome of pure greed. She began bombarding me with questions like a cold-blooded corporate auditor attempting to recover assets from a bankrupt subsidiary. "What about your high-limit life insurance policies, Dad?" she snapped, turning to face me. "Are those still active, or did you let those lapse too? And what about your personal stock portfolio? The offshore investment accounts in the Cayman Islands? The lakefront cabin in New Hampshire? Your primary retirement trust? Tell me exactly what is left." I sat perfectly still, my hands resting flat on the wooden table. "Are you asking because you are worried about my physical survival, Sienna? Or are you simply trying to audit the residual market value of my remaining assets?" Sienna crossed her arms tightly over her chest, her face flushing red with a mixture of anger and embarrassment. "Dad, don't always turn every single conversation into some kind of pathetic moral interrogation. I am trying to be practical here. Tristan and I have built our entire lifestyle and our future financial plans around the transition of your estate." Then, in her sheer frustration and blinding greed, she blurted out a sentence that permanently shattered the very foundation of our relationship. "We already plan to sell this house later anyway, so we need to know if the deed is actually secure." I stopped moving entirely. I stared at my daughter, my voice becoming frighteningly calm, cold, and quiet. "When exactly is later, Sienna?" Sienna suddenly froze. She realized she had let something slip, a dark, hidden calculation that she had never intended to voice in my presence. She looked at me, her lips parting slightly, her eyes darting toward Tristan for support. But Tristan had completely turned away, refusing to make eye contact. "After I die?" I asked directly, my voice slicing through the quiet room like a scalpel. "Is that when you plan to sell my home?" In the days that followed that fateful Sunday afternoon, I continued to play the role of a struggling, desperate old man who had gone completely broke. I didn't ask Sienna for a single dollar. I didn't call her to complain about my imaginary debts, nor did I play the victim. I simply remained silent, watching and observing from the quiet isolation of my Cape Cod cottage. When I was the active, wealthy chairman of Montgomery Custom Yachts, my phone would ring constantly. Sienna would call me at least 4 or 5 times a week. Sometimes she needed me to pull strings to reserve a table at an exclusive five-star restaurant in Boston. Sometimes she needed me to wire her $10,000 to cover a sudden, unexpected credit card bill. Other times, she simply wanted to complain about her high society friends. For 3 days straight, there was not a single text message, not a single phone call, not a passing word of check-in from my only child. On the fourth day, unable to bear the silence any longer, I dialed Sienna's number myself. When she finally answered, her voice was distant, cold, and incredibly hurried, filled with the impatient sigh of someone who had been interrupted by an annoying solicitor. "Hi, Dad," she snapped, the rustle of papers loud in the background. "I'm in the middle of a million things right now. What do you need?" "I just wanted to hear your voice, Sienna," I said softly, letting my tone carry the fragile weight of a lonely old man. "I was also wondering, is Maeve coming over to see her grandpa this weekend? The harbor is beautiful this time of year, and I have some fresh cedar planks in the workshop." Maeve was my 12-year-old granddaughter, a sweet, creative girl who was deeply, passionately attached to me. She had inherited her grandmother Evelyn's artistic soul and my love for craftsmanship. "Probably not this week, Dad," Sienna answered quickly, her tone completely devoid of any maternal warmth. "Maeve has extracurricular tutoring and private violin lessons. Her schedule is absolutely packed." "What about next weekend, then?" I pressed gently. "I could drive over to Chatham and pick her up myself." "We're incredibly busy next week, too, Caleb." Sienna shot back, using my first name instead of Dad, a subtle cutting shift in boundary that she had begun employing. "Tristan and I have a lot of social commitments, and Maeve has a full study schedule. A lot of things have come up lately." I knew for an absolute fact that Maeve's schedule was no busier than usual. She always loved spending her weekends with me, running around my workshop, her hands covered in sawdust, her eyes shining with pure joy. I took a deep, shaky breath over the phone. "Sienna, did I do something wrong? Did I say something to make you angry with me?" Sienna let out a long, heavy, and incredibly patronizing sigh over the line. "It's nothing, Dad. Really. It's just that Tristan and I have a tremendous amount of our own financial stress to deal with right now. And we frankly don't have the emotional capacity to handle your issues, too. We have to focus on our own family. A week later, the tuition invoice for Maeve's private academy in Boston arrived. In the past, I had always happily paid the $40,000 annual tuition in full, seeing it as my duty and joy as a grandfather. I called Sienna to gently remind her that the payment deadline was approaching. Sienna, I said quietly, I received the notification for Maeve's winter term tuition. How do you want to handle it this year? There was a heavy, suffocating silence on the other end of the line for several seconds. Then Sienna spoke in an icy, detached voice. We'll figure it out ourselves, Caleb. Don't worry about it. Sienna, I said, intentionally pushing the boundary of my test. What if, what if my financial situation doesn't recover? What if I genuinely can't afford to help you guys out the way I used to? What if I need your help? Sienna didn't hesitate for a single second. Her response was a sharp, clinical bullet that tore straight through my heart. Then at least don't become a financial burden on us. That was the exact moment something priceless and irreplaceable inside my soul officially died. There are some words that make you explode in an absolute fury of anger. But there are other words. Words of such profound, unadulterated coldness that they make you frighteningly, chillingly calm. 2 days later, a text message from Sienna arrived on my phone. If the bank hasn't foreclosed on the Cape Cod house yet, you should put it up for sale soon. You're old. What's the point of you living all alone in a massive 4-bedroom waterfront house and wasting all that prime space? Sell the property now and use whatever equity is left to cover your living expenses and debts. My fingers trembled as I typed my response. I've lived in this house for 32 years, Sienna. This is the only home you've ever known. It is the house where your mother took her very last breath. Her spirit is in every corner of this place. Sienna's reply came back instantly, cold and completely devoid of any human emotion. Mom died 4 years ago, Dad. You need to stop living in the past and be realistic. The house is a liability now. Sell it. I had prepared myself to witness my daughter's disappointment and frustration when she could no longer receive financial support from me. But I had never, in my wildest nightmares, prepared myself to discover that to Sienna, the very fact that I was still breathing, still living in my own house, was her biggest, most frustrating obstacle. The terrifying truth finally came to light on a cold, foggy Saturday afternoon when Sienna and Tristan drove over to my house to pick up some of their remaining personal belongings from my attic. They thought I was down in my wood shop at the back of the property, but I had stepped into the mudroom to grab a clean rag. Tristan sounded incredibly anxious, his breathing shallow. Sienna, you need to think of something. If your father sells the Cape Cod house now to cover his debts, our entire plan is completely ruined. Harbor One Bank is going to reject our application. I am thinking, Tristan. Sienna snapped back quietly, her voice dripping with a desperate, frantic anger. Stop pressuring me. I didn't expect the old man's business to collapse so suddenly. We just need him to hold on to the property for a few more months until the loan is officially approved. Tristan growled. We've already invested $50,000 of our own money into the franchise fees for the Orospas expansion. If we can't use the Cape Cod estate as our primary collateral, the bank will pull the plug on the $500,000 credit line. We'll lose everything we put in. I know that, Sienna hissed. I'll talk to him. I'll convince him to sign a joint ownership deed or an administrative trust agreement. I'll tell him it's to help him manage his taxes. He's so desperate to keep us close. He'll sign whatever I put in front of him. Just let me handle it. I stood frozen in the dim light of the mudroom, my heart pounding violently. My mind raced, trying to comprehend the scale of their deception. What bank loan? What collateral? The house I had poured 40 years of my life into building, the home where my beloved Evelyn had spent her final days, had been pledged as security for a commercial loan. They had listed my private property on a bank application that I had never seen, never authorized, and never signed. I didn't rush out onto the porch to confront them. A man who has spent 40 years managing massive, complex shipyard operations and custom yacht constructions understands one fundamental rule. Acting on raw, impulsive emotion only ruins the structural integrity of your response. If you want a demolition to be successful, you must plan it with surgical silent precision. The next morning, I drove my old green Ford F-150 into Chatham, parking on a quiet side street. I walked into a small wood-paneled coffee shop to meet Evander Sterling. Evander was not only our longtime family attorney, but he had been my closest friend since our college days at MIT. He had stood beside me at Evelyn's funeral, holding my shoulder when my knees threatened to buckle under the weight of my grief. Evander, I said, setting my cup of hot tea down onto the wooden table. I need you to answer a highly specific legal question for me. Evander lowered his glasses, his sharp, analytical eyes locking onto mine. Of course, Caleb, what is it? If a child tells a commercial bank that they are going to inherit all of their father's assets and uses those anticipated assets as the primary collateral to secure a major business loan, what does that mean legally? Evander's expression instantly turned incredibly serious. He set his coffee cup down with a soft, hollow thud. Caleb, why are you asking me this? Did Sienna do something? I need you to check with Harbor One Bank, I replied quietly, keeping my voice flat and devoid of emotion. Sienna and Tristan have been working with their commercial lending division recently. I need to know exactly what they have submitted. One day later, Evander called me back. His voice over the line was extremely heavy, carrying the grim, solemn tone of a doctor delivering a fatal diagnosis. He confirmed that Sienna and Tristan had applied for a $500,000 commercial loan to launch a New Day Spa franchise or a SPAS. On the application, they listed my Cape Cod estate and primary investment trusts as anticipated inheritance collateral. They hadn't forged my signature on the deeds. They hadn't committed a blatant outright crime yet, but they had boldly, confidently built their entire financial future around my anticipated death. Maybe they only did it to make their application look more credible to the underwriters, Caleb, Evander said, trying to soften the crushing blow. You know how aggressive young entrepreneurs can be. They probably figured it was harmless because the house would eventually come to them anyway. I looked out the window of my office, watching the heavy Atlantic waves crash violently against the gray rocks of the shore. Evander, I whispered, my voice sounding incredibly old, tired, and cold. I'm still alive, my heart is still beating, and yet they are already dividing up my bones. My memories took me back to a quiet, sterile hospital room 4 years ago. Evelyn lay in the hospital bed, her face pale and thin from endless rounds of chemotherapy, her small, frail hand trembling as she squeezed mine. Caleb, she had whispered, her voice barely a breath. Promise me you won't use money to keep Sienna close to you. Let her learn to love you as a father, not as a will. If you keep buying her affection, you will destroy whatever goodness is left in her heart. I had failed to keep that sacred promise. After Evelyn died, the terrifying fear of losing my only remaining connection to her made me spoil Sienna even more. I had used my bank account to buy her presents, treating every holiday and birthday as a transaction. I sat down in Evander's office, reviewing my personal financial records from the past 10 years. I didn't look at them to regret the millions of dollars I had given to Sienna over the decade. I looked at them to recognize a frightening, heartbreaking pattern. Sienna only showed up when she needed money, or when she needed seed capital for Tristan's ventures. Helping your children is a parent's natural instinct and deepest love. But at what point does that help stop being love and become the personal funding of our children's ingratitude? I looked at Evander, my jaw tightening with an unyielding, absolute resolve. I want to change my will, Evander, now. Evander stared at me, his eyes wide with shock. Are you absolutely certain about this, Caleb? This is a monumental decision. There's no going back once the paperwork is filed. I am sure, I replied, quietly. I am certain that my current will does not reflect what Evelyn and I truly wanted for our daughter. We wanted her to be a strong, independent, and honorable woman. Right now, she is nothing more than a parasite waiting for a host to die. I signed the new will exactly 3 days before I sat Sienna down and told her that my business had collapsed. But at that point, deep down in my heart, I still hadn't decided whether I would keep the new document active. I wanted to give my daughter one final, ultimate chance to prove me wrong. The truth was, I wasn't bankrupt at all. Montgomery Custom Yachts had just completed a highly confidential sale of 40% of its shares to a massive Dutch marine conglomerate. The deal had brought in an enormous amount of liquidity, over $32 million in cash. I had staged this bankruptcy not as some childish, vindictive test of loyalty. I did it because I desperately needed an answer about my own place in the heart of my only daughter. I set 3 incredibly strict rules for this test. First, I would never ask Sienna for a single dollar of her own money. Second, I would never do anything to actively harm her or her family. Third, I would never lie about my physical health or any medical danger to my life. In the new will, my Cape Cod estate and 60% of my liquid assets were structured to be transferred directly to the Evelyn Montgomery Memorial Foundation immediately upon my death, with the sole purpose of funding boat building and marine safety programs for underprivileged youth. 30% of my assets were placed in an independent, highly restricted educational trust managed solely by Evander and Cape Cod Trust Bank. dedicated exclusively to my granddaughter Maeve's future college and development expenses. Sienna and Tristan would never be allowed to withdraw a single penny from it. I sent Sienna a text message. Can I stay at your house for a few weeks while I wait for the bank to resolve the issues with the Cape Cod property? I watched the screen. The message showed as read almost instantly. 1 hour passed, then 2 hours. Finally, Sienna's reply appeared. Our house is pretty cramped these days, Dad. We really don't have the space, I texted back. I only need to sleep on the living room sofa, Sienna. I won't get in your way. Sienna's response was cold and clinical. Tristan needs a quiet, undisturbed space in the living room to work on his spa business plans at night. It just wouldn't work out. Why don't you ask Evander? He lives alone in that massive apartment in Boston. I stared at the screen, a bitter, hollow laugh escaping my throat. I had let Sienna and Tristan live in my Cape Cod home for 2 full years after they graduated from college, entirely rent-free. I had paid for every single one of their meals, paid their utilities, and supported them while they figured out their careers. That evening, my phone rang. It was a secret, whispered call from my granddaughter Maeve. "Grandpa?" she whispered, her sweet voice trembling with a deep, anxious worry. "Are you there?" "Yes, sweetheart," I replied, my voice instantly softening. "I'm here, Grandpa. I heard Mom talking to Dad this afternoon. She said you might have to move away from Cape Cod because you lost your money. Will I still get to see you often?" "Of course, sweetheart," I said, blinking back the tears that were suddenly threatening to spill from my eyes. "Grandpa will always be here for you, no matter what." Maeve hesitated, her voice dropping even lower. "But Mom said you're poor now, so we should visit you less from now on. She said we need to give you space so you can focus on working and paying off your debts. Is that true, Grandpa?" I froze, a suffocating, freezing weight settling over my chest. Sienna wasn't just draining all affection from our relationship. She was actively using my 12-year-old granddaughter as a weapon to punish a father who no longer had any commercial value to her. The test was officially over. I decided not to reveal the truth immediately. I wanted to give Sienna one final, face-to-face opportunity to look me in the eyes and tell me the truth. I drove my old, green Ford F-150 to her house in Chatham on a Tuesday afternoon. When Tristan opened the front door, his displeasure was immediately obvious. He frowned, barely opening the door wide enough for me to step inside. Sienna came out of the living room, her arms crossed, a deep, irritated scowl on her face. "Why did you come over without calling first, Dad?" she snapped. "We're in the middle of preparing dinner." "I only need 10 minutes to talk to you, Sienna," I said, walking straight into the living room and sitting down on the sofa. I looked directly into her cold, green eyes. "I want to ask you one question, and I want an honest answer." Sienna rolled her eyes, letting out an impatient huff. "Oh my God, Dad. Are you starting your pathetic manipulative psychological games again? I have my own life, my own family, and my own stress to deal with. I can't spend my entire day revolving around you and your dramatic emotional crises." "I have never asked you to solve a single one of my problems, Sienna," I replied, my voice dangerously calm. "You are only upset because I can no longer solve your financial problems." Sienna shot to her feet, her face flushing red with a sudden roaring anger. "You always think everyone around you only cares about your money. You think you're some kind of saint because you wrote checks." "No," I paused, looking deeply into her eyes. "I just discovered that there is one person who truly, desperately does care only about my money." "Who?" Sienna sneered, her jaw tightening. "You!" The room seemed to explode. Sienna began screaming, dragging up every single resentment from her childhood to justify her cruelty. I didn't defend myself. Sat quietly, letting her words wash over me. "I admit that mistake, Sienna," I said softly, nodding my head. "I missed many school plays, and I missed many weekends because I was too busy building a business to secure your future. I tried to make up for my absence with expensive gifts and financial support. I am truly, deeply sorry for that." "Get out!" Sienna screamed, pointing her finger violently toward the front door. "I don't want Maeve around a bitter, toxic, and manipulative old man like you. Get out of my house." I stood up slowly. I didn't raise my voice, I didn't shout, and I didn't threaten to cut her out of the will. I simply looked at her one last time, feeling a strange, hollow peace wash over me. "I understand," I said quietly. I turned around and walked out of the house, never once looking back. 2 days after that agonizing confrontation in Chatham, I received an unexpected text message from Sienna. "We're celebrating Maeve's 12th birthday at the Oyster Pavilion on Waterfront this Thursday at 6. We'd love for you to join us, Dad." For a fleeting, desperate moment, a spark of hope flared in my chest. I wanted to believe that she had thought about our conversation, that she felt remorseful for her coldness, and that this invitation was her quiet, prideful way of extending an olive branch. But the moment I stepped through the heavy glass doors of the restaurant, I realized with a crushing, suffocating certainty that I was wrong. Sienna had not invited me to reconcile. The Oyster Pavilion was a highly prestigious waterfront establishment filled with the soft clinking of crystal glasses, the aroma of expensive seafood, and the low murmur of wealthy local socialites. The long dining table was surrounded by dozens of relatives from both sides of the family. I arrived exactly on time, dressed in my simple worn flannel shirt and plain trousers. In my hand I carried a modest, carefully wrapped gift bag. As I approached the table, Sienna's gaze locked onto my simple gift bag. She openly, dramatically curled her lip in disgust, her voice cutting through the laughter of the table like a razor. "Is that seriously all you brought for your only granddaughter's 12th birthday, Dad?" she scoffed, making sure her voice was loud enough to carry to the aunts and uncles sitting nearby. "Maeve has been begging for an expensive high-end computer to learn digital design and programming. I thought you would have at least tried to make an effort." "Maeve always loved those old photographs of her grandmother, Sienna," I explained gently, keeping my tone calm and steady. "And this model sailboat is made of solid cedar. It has a great deal of sentimental value." Sienna let out a loud, mocking laugh that froze the atmosphere at the table instantly. "Oh, right, I completely forgot. Grandpa has to practice cutting back on his expenses these days. We all have to make sacrifices, don't we?" My sister-in-law, Aunt Clara, looked up with a worried, startled expression. "What's going on, Sienna? Is Caleb having some kind of financial trouble?" Sienna casually took a sip of her white wine, leaning back with an air of triumphant, mocking arrogance. "Oh, haven't you heard, Aunt Clara? Dad's brilliant custom yacht business completely collapsed. He's entirely bankrupt. He doesn't have a single dollar left." The entire table fell into a deathly, suffocating silence. The clinking of silverware stopped completely. Dozens of eyes turned to stare at me, some filled with pity, others with awkward embarrassment. Tristan reached over, lightly tugging on Sienna's silk sleeve. "Sienna, that's enough. Today is Maeve's birthday. Let's not do this here." But Sienna's arrogance, fueled by the intoxicating feeling that she had finally defeated the powerful, invincible father she had spent her life trying to please or manipulate, made it impossible for her to stop. She leaned forward, looking me straight in the eyes, her expression twisted into a cruel, mocking smile. "You know what the absolute funniest part of this is, Dad," she sneered. "Your entire life, you were always so incredibly proud of your wealth. You always held it over my head, acting like you were going to leave me this massive, prestigious maritime fortune. But now that you've lost everything, at least I don't have to pretend to care about your boring, headache-inducing custom yacht designs or your shipyard business anymore." A heavy, suffocating silence hung over the table. My 12-year-old granddaughter, Maeve, stared at her mother with wide, horrified eyes, her small face pale and trembling with a mixture of confusion and deep, aching hurt. I sat perfectly still. I didn't raise my voice, I didn't defend my career, and I didn't argue. I slowly, deliberately set my glass of water down onto the white tablecloth. I looked at my daughter, memorizing every single feature of her smug, victorious face. In that moment, I no longer wanted Sienna to apologize to me. I only wanted her to remember every single syllable she had just uttered. Because by tomorrow morning, those very words would cost her more than anything I had ever bought for her, throughout her entire 38 years of life. I quietly stood up from the table, walked past my silent relatives, and stepped out of the restaurant. As I walked across the rain-slicked gravel parking lot, the cold New England wind biting at my face, I heard the frantic, rapid patter of small footsteps running after me. I turned around. Maeve was running toward me, her winter coat flying open, her eyes streaming with tears. She threw her small arms tightly around my waist, burying her face into my old flannel shirt, sobbing uncontrollably. "Grandpa, I don't care about the computer. I love the sailboat you carved for me, and I love you. Even if you're poor and don't have any money left, I still love you more than anything in the world." I knelt down on the wet gravel, wrapping my arms tightly around my little granddaughter, my own tears finally spilling over my lashes, hot and thick. This sweet, innocent 12-year-old child had just given me the one thing her mother never could. A pure, unconditional love that didn't come with a price tag, a love that wasn't bound by a commercial contract. "Thank you, my sweet girl," I whispered, kissing her hair. "Grandpa loves you more than life itself. Go back inside now. I promise everything is going to be all right." At exactly 8 o'clock the next morning, Evander Sterling arrived at my cottage. He was carrying a thick, leather-bound legal folder containing my completed, finalized will. "Caleb," Evander said, his voice grave as he looked at me, "have you thought this through carefully? Once we execute this and notify them, the damage to your relationship with Sienna will be permanent. File the paperwork, Evander, I replied quietly, my voice as hard and unyielding as structural steel. This time, I am completely certain, and schedule a mandatory meeting with Sienna and Tristan at your office this afternoon at 3. At 3 o'clock, Sienna and Tristan walked into the spacious, mahogany-paneled conference room of Evander's law office. They looked incredibly annoyed, believing this meeting was nothing more than a tedious administrative chore to deal with my bankruptcy debts. I really don't have time for this, Dad, Sienna complained as she threw her designer handbag onto the polished table and sat down. Tristan and I have a meeting with our franchise coordinators in an hour. What do you need us to sign? Evander stepped forward, placing the thick, blue legal folder in the center of the table. We are meeting today to formally clarify the structure of Caleb Montgomery's estate and asset distribution plan. Sienna let out a sharp, mocking curl of her lip. What estate plan is there to discuss, Uncle Evander? Dad doesn't have any assets left except a massive pile of debt and a foreclosed house. We'll waste our time here. I looked directly into Sienna's cold, green eyes. My voice was calm, quiet, and frighteningly steady. I'm not bankrupt, Sienna. The conference room suddenly fell into an absolute, suffocating silence. Sienna froze, her hand hovering over her phone, her eyes widening. What did you just say? She whispered. I didn't lose the Cape Cod house, I continued, my gaze unwavering. I don't have a single dollar of debt. Montgomery Custom Yachts is still doing exceptionally well. In fact, we just finalized a $32 million cash acquisition deal with a major Dutch marine conglomerate last week. Sienna's face shifted rapidly from smug impatience to a pale, horrified mask of absolute disbelief. Every single feature on her face twisted as the reality of my words slammed into her mind like a physical blow. You lied to me? She shrieked, her voice cracking as she shot to her feet, slamming her hand violently onto the polished mahogany table. You tricked me? Why would you set up this sick, twisted, and insane psychological game? This wasn't a game, Sienna, I replied quietly. This was the first time in 38 years that I stopped paying to see what was left between us besides my bank account. And I got my answer. Evander opened the blue folder, his voice ringing through the quiet room with a clinical, legal authority. I will now formally read the structure of Caleb Montgomery's latest legally recognized will, executed and filed 3 days prior to his financial announcement. Sienna began breathing heavily, her chest heaving as she gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles turning stark white. Dad, did you cut me out of the will? No, Sienna. I looked at her, my heart entirely still. I just made sure that my death would no longer be your retirement plan. Evander began reading the document. Full ownership of the Cape Cod estate, along with 60% of the total liquid assets of the estate, will be transferred in full to the Evelyn Montgomery Memorial Foundation immediately upon Caleb's passing, for the sole purpose of building marine sanctuaries and educational programs for underprivileged children. Sienna let out a loud, hysterical scream, tears of pure fury and devastation streaming down her cheeks. No, you can't do this. Mom would never want you to do something this insane. That house belongs to me. Never use your mother's name to justify your selfish, greedy desires, I snapped, my voice rising with an authority that shook the room, silencing her instantly. Before your mother died, she took my hand and begged me to let you learn to stand on your own 2 feet. She didn't want you to become a parasite waiting for us to die so you could inherit our hard work. Evander continued reading. 30% of the total liquid assets will be placed in an independent, highly restricted educational trust managed solely by Evander Sterling and Cape Cod Trust Bank, dedicated exclusively to Maeve's future college, housing, and developmental needs. Neither Sienna nor Tristan will be allowed to withdraw a single dollar from this trust. Sienna collapsed onto the leather chair, sobbing hysterically. For the first time in many years, I saw genuine, unshielded devastation on her face. She wasn't some monstrous, cartoonish villain. She was simply the tragic accumulation of the mistakes I had made in raising her. You never understood me, she choked out through her tears. I grew up always feeling like your shipyard, your yachts, and your money were more important to you than I was. You were never truly there for me. I sat in silence for a few seconds, slowly nodding my head in agreement. You're right, Sienna, I admitted softly. I made that mistake. I missed your school plays, and I missed your weekends because I was too busy building an empire to secure your future. I tried to make up for my absence with expensive gifts and blank checks. I am truly deeply sorry for that. But my mistakes in the past do not buy you the right to treat me like a personal, bottomless ATM. Do you want me to beg you, Dad? She sobbed, looking up at me with eyes red with devastation. No, Sienna, I said, slowly shaking my head. I don't need you to beg. I don't want anything from you. That is what you have never been able to understand. I didn't change my will to punish you, or to force you to pretend to love me. Tristan finally spoke, his voice trembling violently as he realized their spa franchise was officially ruined. What about the spa loan, Caleb? The bank is going to reject our application without the Cape Cod estate as collateral. Then I suggest you find another way to fund your lifestyle, Tristan, I said coldly. Sienna and Tristan left the attorney's office that afternoon without hugging me, without apologizing, and without saying goodbye. 6 months passed without a single word of contact between us. I continued to live my quiet life in the old Cape Cod cottage. I didn't spend my money extravagantly to get revenge on my daughter, nor did I buy flashy luxury cars to show off. I spent my time actively running the Evelyn Montgomery Memorial Foundation, organizing boat building workshops for young kids. As for Sienna and Tristan, the failed loan forced them to abandon their unrealistic franchise plans. Sienna had to return to working full-time as an office administrator, struggling to manage their heavy mortgage, while Tristan worked 60 hours a week as a junior insurance salesman. Then, on a quiet, foggy afternoon in late April, my doorbell rang. I pulled open the door. Sienna was standing on my porch. She wore no expensive designer clothes, no glittering jewelry, and carried no luxury handbag. She wore a simple knit sweater and plain jeans. She had come completely alone. "Can I come in, Dad?" she asked softly, her voice barely a whisper. We sat down at the very same kitchen table where the painful story had begun 6 months earlier. Sienna looked around the quiet, familiar kitchen, then slowly lowered her head. "I still hate that you put me through that test, Caleb," she whispered, her shoulders shaking as she fought back tears. "I still think it was wrong. I understand," I replied gently, "and I accept that." Sienna choked up, a hot tear spilling down her cheek. But I hate what I saw in myself during that test even more. I had become so incredibly ugly, so greedy, and so entitled. I took your love and your sweat for granted, acting as though your money was my personal birthright. And the moment I thought you were broke, I only thought about what I was losing, instead of what you were going through. I am so incredibly sorry, Dad. I looked at her, my heart entirely still, searching her eyes. "Are you apologizing because you want me to change the will back, Sienna?" Sienna looked directly into my eyes, and for the first time in nearly 20 years, I saw absolute, unadulterated sincerity in her gaze. "Whether you change that will back or not, Caleb, I am still sorry. I just want my father back." A slow, warm smile finally spread across my face. I stood up, walked around the table, and opened my arms. Sienna rushed into my embrace, clutching my flannel shirt and crying like a little child, letting go of decades of buried resentment and greed. "I love you, sweetheart," I whispered, holding her tight. "But we are going to rebuild this relationship from the very beginning. And we are going to do it without a single dollar of my money." "Without money," she repeated, nodding her head through her tears. 1 year has passed since that afternoon. The new will remains completely untouched, and Sienna knows it. But strangely, our relationship has become warmer, deeper, and more genuine than ever before. Now, whenever she calls, I no longer have to ask myself that bitter, exhausting question: how much is this call going to cost me? I used to think that a father's greatest responsibility was to accumulate as much wealth as possible and leave it as a soft velvet runway for his children. I was wrong. The greatest legacy I will leave Sienna is not this historic Cape Cod house, not the yacht design company, and not the bank accounts. The greatest legacy is the day I finally had the courage to tell her, "I love you, but my love will never come with a blank check again." If you are a parent, I want to leave you with one final profound question. What is more frightening? Disappointing your children today by drawing an unyielding boundary, or leaving them completely unable to stand on their own feet when you are no longer in this world? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for joining Dad's Real Life Revenge, and make sure to subscribe to the channel for more heartfelt family stories.